Hi, my name is Lindsey Jones. I'm a PhD student here at UVA in the Curry School of Education, working on history of African American education. And I'm also a first-year predoctoral fellow at the Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies. And the panel that I'm presenting to you today is From Freedom Now to Black Lives Matter, Legacies of the Civil Rights Movement in Contemporary Social Protest. I won't go into any long introductions of the panelists because you have their biographies in your programs, but I want to just briefly tell you their names. First we have Jeanne Theoharis and Hasan Kwame Jeffries and Taylor Branch, and so we look forward to hearing their remarks on the contemporary movement for Black lives and its historical context. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It is really wonderful to be here, but it is a bit intimidating to be going so late in the day after so many sort of, I texted Hasan right at the end of the last presentation and was just like, I don't know how we follow that. And I wanted to, as many people have said, to sort of thank particularly Professor Deborah McDowell, both for the incredible organization, but also for really making clear that at the center of this honoring of Julian Bond was going to be thinking about the present and insisting that we do not do what so many people are doing in this contemporary moment, which is separating the civil rights movement, cordoning it off, raising it up, and making it, you know, unavailable for where we need it today. So I am so grateful for that. In July, in the midst of protests around the country around the police killings of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, Atlanta Mayor Kasim Reed invoked the history of Martin Luther King to celebrate Atlanta's tradition of freedom of speech, but then scolded the protesters, and I quote him, "Dr. King would never take a highway." Earlier last year, Reverend Barbara Reynolds, herself a part of the civil rights movement, took to the pages of the Washington Post to criticize this new generation of protesters, and I quote her, "Many in my crowd admire the cause and courage of these young activists, but fundamentally disagree with their approach. Trained in the tradition of Martin Luther King, we were nonviolent activists who won hearts by conveying respectability and changing laws by delivering a message of love and unity. BLM seems intent on rejecting our proven ways." Across the political spectrum, from Republican presidential candidate Mike Huckabee, who said King would be, quote, appalled by Black Lives Matter, to Andrew Young, who said, "Those are some unlovable little brats. They're showing off, and not even with a clear message." Many have invoked the civil rights movement recently to criticize and chastise Black Lives Matter. These framings both misrepresent the movements Black Lives Matter activists are building around the country and the history of the civil rights movement as I was taught it 2 decades ago by Professor Julian Bond. Of course, King took many a highway. The movement wasn't unified but contentious. It was disruptive and made people uncomfortable then, just as it does today. And even in the moments when activists purposefully donned respectable attire or spoke the King's English, they were regularly treated as un-American, annoying, disruptive, and disturbing, just as they are today. Such historical revisionism and the troubling ways the civil rights movement is being invoked in our contemporary moment is both dangerous and, I would argue, comfortable. Dangerous because it grossly distorts how the civil rights movement actually proceeded, and comfortable because it allows many Americans to keep today's movements at arm's length. This repeated comparison has become one of the many ways that many people justify hand-wringing on the sidelines, as if they would act given a righteous movement like Dr. King's. But today's activists are simply too excessive, too disruptive, and too unrespectable. Calling out these myths is more than setting the historical record straight. A century ago, W.E.B. Du Bois reminded us of the propaganda of history and how it becomes a way of, quote, giving a false but pleasurable sense of accomplishment, for soothing and justifying inaction in the face of persistent racial inequality. I had the great good fortune to take a class with Professor Julian Bond more than 2 decades ago when I was an undergraduate, and then a few years later to serve as one of his teaching assistants. He became a lifelong mentor and friend. Julian Bond was a titan of social justice leadership, as we have heard, and a lifelong freedom fighter. But alongside that voice for justice, one of his greatest gifts was that of a teacher and movement intellectual. To teach about the movement was a way to carry it forward to a new generation, and he thrilled to this. But he did not do so to tell young people what to do, that the activists of old had, quote, the right way that needed to be drummed into us. Quite the contrary. Rather, he sought to challenge the master narrative, the myths and fables that had grown up around the movement and popular memory of it, to make sure we understood the power of youth leadership and grasped both the difficulty and necessity and tremendous power of building movements as ordinary people. He taught us as a way to move the struggle forward, that to see the movement in its full complexity, to understand what it took, the many, many people who pushed it forward and the many, many people who stood in its way, was necessary to understanding our place today. And so to me, one urgent way to honor his legacy is to challenge these myths that have grown up around the civil rights movement, these fables that have become barriers and brambles to a new generation of activists, to challenge the master narrative, as he put it, as Rosa sat down, Martin stood up, then the white folks saw the light and saved the day. Or in a somewhat less sassy fashion, he characterized this problematic master narrative as such. Traditionally, I'm quoting him at length here, traditionally, relationships between the races in the South were oppressive. In 1954, the Supreme Court decided this was wrong. Inspired by the court, courageous Americans, black and white, took to protests in the street in form of sit-ins, bus boycotts, and freedom rides. The protest movement, led by the brilliant and eloquent Dr. Martin Luther King, aided by a sympathetic federal government, most notably the Kennedy brothers and a born-again Lyndon Johnson, was able to make America understand racial discrimination as a moral issue. Once Americans understood that discrimination was wrong, they quickly moved to remove racial prejudice and discrimination from American life, as evidenced by the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act of 64 and 65. Inexplicably, just as the civil rights victories were piling up, many African Americans under the banner of Black Power turned their backs on American society. So what I wanted to use the rest of my time to do today was to sort of identify kind of 6 lessons that he taught me, or to challenge 6 myths of the civil rights movement as it has been invoked recently around Black Lives Matter. The first, movements are made. They don't just happen. It wasn't, right? Rosa Parks sat down and people boycotted the buses. One of my first memories of Julian Bond, he began his civil rights movement class with 3 lectures on the Montgomery bus boycott. And there I am, a junior, and I'm like, why is he taking so long? We are never even going to get to 1958 at this point. But what he did, he started in the 30s and 40s. He went person by person. He traced all of this history before the boycott. And then, once we got to Rosa Parks' stand, he went minute by minute, hour by hour, who called whom. Rosa Parks calls young lawyer Fred Gray. Young lawyer Fred Gray calls the head of the Women's Political Council, Joanne Robinson. E.D. Nixon calls the ministers. He calls reporter Joe Asbell. Joanne Robinson sneaks in Alabama State College and runs off 35,000 leaflets, and on and on. And what he did by those 3 days on the Montgomery bus boycott is he showed how the civil rights movement happened, not just that it happened, but how it did. And so it was much more possible then to imagine how you do it again. Lesson 2. The civil rights movement was not created by presidents or charismatic speakers, but by the efforts and freedom visions of everyday local people possessing great courage and vision. And many, many of those people were young people. So one of the things that he did throughout the class was lift up the young people, and particularly the very young people. Barbara Johns, 15-year-old Barbara Johns, who led a student strike, and that was one of the cases that formed one of the 5 cases in the Brown decision. Claudette Colvin and Mary Louise Smith, 2 teenagers in Montgomery who resist on the bus and really lay the groundwork for why people rise up when Rosa Parks makes her stand. The Little Rock Nine, and of course, Julian Bond's many friends and comrades in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Young people lead, he would teach us, and the nation will ultimately be forced to follow. But, as he also reminded us, while there were elders who supported and nourished their work, this kind of youth leadership and youth activism scared many people then, just as it scares people now. So he cautioned we shouldn't be surprised when adults, even adults claiming sympathy to our cause, are some of the first to criticize us. The task of social justice requires years and decades. The idea that King or Snick revealed injustice of the country and then the country fixed it is a deep distortion. He taught, but again, what it required was doing things again and again and again to create a sense of persistent uncomfortableness. I mean, that was really one of the lessons he gave, was that it's not injustice brought to the light and then people just rush to change it. It's that you have to do it over and over until it becomes so uncomfortable that people are forced to change it. Lesson 3, real social change is unpopular, and no amount of respectability protects you from that criticism or that unpopularity. The majority of Americans at the time did not support the civil rights movement. Just to give you a few statistics, in May 1961, in a Gallup survey, only 22% of Americans approved of what the Freedom Riders were doing, and 57% of Americans said, quote, this is the Gallup question, the sit-ins at lunch counters, freedom buses, and other demonstrations by Negroes were hurting the Negroes' chances of being integrated in the South. So that's more than a majority. Lest we see this as Southerners skewing this national sample, in 1964, this is a year before the passage of the Voting Rights Act, in a poll conducted by the New York Times of New Yorkers, a majority of New Yorkers said that the civil rights movement had gone too far, this is 1964, and spoke of black people receiving, quote, everything on a silver platter, and of reverse discrimination against white people. In 1966, in a nationwide poll, 85% of white people and 30% of black people nationally believed that demonstrations by black people on civil rights were hurting the advancement of civil rights. And so, as Julian Bond made clear to us, the embrace of the civil rights movement happened years and in most cases decades after it occurred. He reminded us that your righteousness will not be validated necessarily in the moment, that it required faith and steadfastness and community and, frankly, sheer orneriness, because the criticism and demonization were intense and very real. Lesson 4, there was nothing inexplicable about Black power. One of the things that he really showed us, and again, by beginning this history much earlier, right, is how it's not inexplicable if you start the story at the beginning, right? So you need to start the story of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, right, in the sellout of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or before that. You need to start the story of the community control movement in Ocean Hill-Brownsville with a decade-long movement in New York City trying to get the New York City Board of Ed to try to even make a plan for comprehensive desegregation in New York City, which never happens. You need to start the story of the Watts Uprising a decade earlier in the movements around housing desegregation, school desegregation, jobs, and anti-police brutality that occur in California in the decade before the Watts Uprising. He also reminded us that the Black freedom struggle was part of a larger global human rights freedom struggle. And they made global connections from, as we've seen, the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa to the Vietnam War, to anti-colonial struggles on the continent of Africa, to Palestinian self-determination. And as we've seen again in the recent movement for Black Lives Matter movement, just as it happened to them, right, making common cause with international struggles was, like it was then as it is today, often deemed getting out of your lane, right? And the kind of criticisms that we've seen when the movement for Black Lives sort of referenced Palestinian human rights were criticisms that they had also faced in terms of the kind of global solidarities. Lesson 5, learning is essential for movements and teachers, and not to kind of be ashamed when you don't know the whole story. I wrote a biography of Rosa Parks, and Julian Bond was extremely helpful in helping me do that, in part because he realized what he didn't know. And I quote him, "I met her numerous times over her lifetime. I just talked to her about innocuous things. I thought I knew everything to know about her." And so Julian helped me for years open doors to be able to tell that story of Rosa Parks, not just in Montgomery, but in Detroit, and was determined to help me tell that story and determined to make sure that people heard it. And so he then arranged for me to tell the whole board of the NAACP because he felt that this is history that people need to hear, not. And finally, I think lesson 6 is the power of mentorship. One of my favorite stories he would tell about Ella Baker is that Ella Baker would sit with them through these hours and hours long meeting, and people would smoke. And Ella Baker hated the smoke, and she would wear a mask. And she would sit there, and people would smoke, and it would take hours and hours and hours and hours. And she would sit, and she would be with them, and she would help them get where they needed to go. And that's what mentoring looks like. Like Ella Baker, Julian Bond was not a fair weather mentor. He didn't just write a blurb or a letter of recommendation, any of which would have been an incredible honor. He was a movement mentor, understanding what it takes to help someone find her voice. In this current moment we live in, where people are always marking how busy they are, how full their plate is, Professor Bond was quite different. He helped and assisted, wrote back religiously to emails, sent notes like it was no big deal. Like he wasn't too busy and he didn't have to remind you of all the work he was doing. He thrilled to new movements, like the Dream Defenders and the Dreamers, seeing himself in them and avoiding the tendency to feel like he should tell them what to do or how to do. In the end, he showed me, mentoring is not about being the mentor. It's about enabling the person to fly differently and farther than we do. And that was the power of the civil rights movement, as Julian Bond taught it. It was an amazing, breathtaking group of people that changed themselves and their neighbors and moved the nation in myriad important ways. But it was not the gold standard to which everything must conform, but a launching pad for us to imagine going farther and demand of the nation an intersectional global justice as yet unseen. Thank you.
Good afternoon to Dr. McDowell and to the faculty and staff and students here at UVA and the Carter Woodson Institute. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate and be a part of this symposium and occasion. And thank you for having it. Thank you for putting in the time and the resources and the effort to bring us all together. I never had the honor and pleasure of sitting in a class with Julian Bond, so I can't speak directly to his mentorship. But Jeanne Theoharis has been a mentor to me in so many ways for the last more than a decade now, almost before I finished up my first article in a collected edition was a book that she edited, and she continues to be. Took me on a walk this morning. Notice, I didn't say we went together. She took me on a walk this morning. How you doing? What's up with the family? What's going on with the project? Well, you need to think about this, that, and the other. So the lessons that Julian imparted to her, she has definitely taken them in and shared them, and I'm now trying to do that with my graduate students. So thank you very much, Jeanne. I have a few minutes, and I've been asked to talk about some of the legacies of the civil rights movement in contemporary social protest. As Jeanne mentioned, we were sitting back and listening to the last panel, and you know, I teach, so I can neither confirm nor deny that we were texting during the panel. But somehow the message was conveyed between us that, wow, that really should have been the last panel. I mean, these students were fantastic. And, you know, I was thinking about Rebecca, and I'm glad you shared that story about Ben Carson, because, you know, he did do something good. So I really, in thinking about my remarks, how I want you to think about them, I kind of want you to think about them as kind of a postscript, right? Kind of putting into context some of the things that we've been hearing over the last 2 days, but certainly in that last panel. There are some real points of similarity, points of convergence, as well as divergence between the activism of young people during the high point of the civil rights movement in the 1960s and what we are seeing today. First, it's important that we locate the activism of young people today on the continuum of the African American freedom struggle. We do a disservice to ourselves and to the young people who are protesting and putting their lives on the line today if we pretend as though they just appeared out of nowhere. That young people have not been engaged in protest and activism from the 60s forward. I mean, certainly those who were in the 60s, Charlie Cobb, Judy Richardson, Julian Bond, never stopped. Right? That's 50 years of struggle, which is absurd, but that's what they did. But there were generations in between, young people who continued to, that never had the light shined on them. And so it's important that we locate the young people who are engaged today on that continuum of struggle, not just to the 60s, but to the Black Power generation, to those activists in the 80s who were engaged in the Free South Africa movement, those who were part of the hip-hop generation, which supposedly I am, in the 90s and today. So it's definitely a continuum that's important that we recognize. But there's something different and something special that's going on right now. And when we look back at it from the benefit of time, or with the benefit of time, I think one thing that we will see in comparison to that special generation of the 1960s is the origins. Again, it's not that protest wasn't going on before, but there was something that happened that really ignited a fire in the hearts of young folk. And as I look back on it, and others have as well, for many, even as Rebecca had pointed out, it was the killing of Trayvon Martin. We know that in looking back at the movement in the 60s, many will point to or describe them as, especially the young people, as the Emmett Till generation. 1955, August of 1955, young 14-year-old Emmett Till, visiting family down in Mississippi, is brutally murdered, lynched in 1955. And the spark that ignites in the hearts of young people who were his age. It's not a coincidence that 5 years later, Emmett Till was 14 years old. He would have been a freshman or sophomore, perhaps at NCCU in 1960 or 61 when the sit-ins started, that this was his generation. Ann Moody writes movingly about it in her book, Coming of Age of Mississippi, of the impact that Emmett Till's murder had on him, and that she was a part of this generation. Well, I think in a few years' time, and we've already begun to talk about this generation being the Trayvon Martin generation. And it was in part because it's obvious that so many could see themselves in Trayvon Martin, in how he was treated, and how he was killed, how he was profiled, and also, and this is another similarity to the Emmett Till moment, if you will, how his murderer was treated, the point of justice denied. The fact that George Zimmerman was not arrested for another 44 days, a month and a half, the fact that he goes on trial and is eventually acquitted. The fact that now looking back at it, you may recall, my students told me this the other day, I wasn't aware of this. I wasn't following this aspect of the news, but you know, he got into that. He's always just George Zimmerman characters, always getting into these incidents. And the fella, he got into this road rage incident a few years, you know, last year or so. And the fella who they exchanged gunfire or something, this guy just got sentenced, who took some shots at George Zimmerman and missed, just got sentenced to 20 years in prison. 20 years in prison for missing. For that, I wish he had better aim. Did I just say that out loud? I don't know. I thought that. But they're connected to these two is also the idea of images and media. Right? Well, the media that captured the minds, that really drove home, the image that drove home sort of what young black folk are at risk of was that picture of Emmett Till's brutalized body in the casket that gets circulated in Jet magazine. Interestingly enough, there are no images of Trayvon Martin's sort of brutalized body, but what we do have are those pictures of a George Zimmerman claiming to have been beat up by this youngster, and you look at them and you're like, there's a disconnect there. Like, we're not seeing, so it was still images. But the power of these images continue on because although there are no images, no video of that moment when Trayvon Martin loses his life, we certainly see in this recent wave those images of so many young black folk, young black men, young black boys who are losing their lives. Whether it is Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Eric Garner in New York. And so the power of these images to drive home what it is that young black folk are facing in this world is one of those similarities between that civil rights generation in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and this Emmett Till generation today. Strategies and tactics are another place where we're seeing similarities. Certainly, the embrace of nonviolent civil disobedience in the 1960s by young activists, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and others. And we're seeing that today among young people taking to the streets in nonviolent civil disobedience. It's okay to take control of a highway. You know, you're in Atlanta, I-85, that's always getting crowded. So that's all right to take it over for a while. They'll get used to the traffic. But it's also important, and this, you know, we tend to shy away from. We certainly, as scholars, have tended to shy away from it as we talked about the 1960s is, look, not everybody was as nonviolent as we would have liked or hoped them to be. And don't expect everybody to be as nonviolent as you may like and hope them to be today among young people. And we have to take seriously the ways in which young people today want to express their protest, their rage, their frustration, their anger when they are not being heard. I don't think, and we have to take seriously the power of those expressions. We really have to wonder how much national attention would have been in Baltimore, Maryland, had not those young folk taken to the streets when they did. And so when we look back at the movement in the 60s, we really have to be in conversation with those who were willing to take up nonviolent struggle, but then also non-violent struggle. I didn't say armed self-defense, I just said non-violent struggle. But tactics and strategies, there really is points of connection, points of synergy that we need to be mindful of. Movement tools and techniques. When we're thinking about putting into historical context what we are seeing today from our young people, certainly tools and techniques, the ways they go about shaping and controlling the narrative of the movement. Julian Bond in SNCC, he just wasn't a SNCC activist, he was the director of communications. He understood the value of communication. He understood the value of getting out the news from the perspective of the activists themselves, challenging the mainstream media's normative narrative of protest, what people were fighting for and what they were fighting against. And so young folk are doing the exact same thing today. The power of social media today is that it allows for young activists to offer up a counter narrative, to draw attention to stories that we otherwise wouldn't be familiar with. otherwise wouldn't know, that are then drawing the eyes of the mainstream media. That's all being done by folk on the ground. There's real power to that and a connection to the past. That being said, the one thing that social media isn't doing and probably can't do is it can't replace mainstream corporate media. So you can offer a new narrative, but that does not mean that you're going to be able to control the telling of that narrative once it gets out into the mainstream. So young activists are going to have to think about other ways of countering the narrative and these stories once it gets out there. We see so much of the criticism about Black Lives Matter movements and protests and marches that the mainstream media tries to spin. And then, you don't have an equal voice. I grew up in New York. You had 4 channels back then. You don't have a 5th channel for progressive social movements. So you got to figure out another way to counter those narratives. Obstacles and opposition. This is also critically important, and a place where we see real similarities, right? When we think about the 1960s, there's a real myth about who the opposition was during the height of the movement. That it was just 1 or 2 bad folk, right? That it was a George Wallace, that it was a Sheriff Jim Clark, just 1 or 2 bad people. I call them crazy crackers, right? This is 1 or 2. I don't know how you sign that, but make sure you get it right. Just 1 or 2. Just 1 or 2 crazy crackers, right? But the reality is, it wasn't just 1 or 2 people. It wasn't just 1 or 2 crazy crackers, although we may like to think so, right? Like George Wallace wasn't a crazy cracker. He was the governor of the state of Alabama. Ross Barnett wasn't some crazy out-of-step cracker. He was the governor of Mississippi, right? The problem wasn't 1 or 2 bad people. The problem was the society in which we all lived. It was America. But if you say it's just 1 or 2 bad people, it's just a rogue cop, then the solution is simple. Just get rid of that one person. But the reality is, even if you remove that one person, if you're not dealing with the institutions and structures that enable it to happen, then the problem doesn't change. And we're seeing the same thing when we have this criticism, or you have the critique of the systems of sort of police violence and police brutality. People say, oh, even if you get them to admit anything, it's just 1 or 2 bad cops in LA, even if you're willing to get them to go that far. But it's not about 1 or 2 bad cops. It's about a system and a culture of policing in America that has to be changed, and a system and culture of framing policing and framing sort of Black behavior and criminalizing that has to change. So the obstacles and the opposition, even after 50 years' time, has remained fundamentally the same. And especially when you think about police, right? Because one of the things that we've done is we've said that the problem of racial violence and racial terror in America during the civil rights movement was fundamentally a problem generated by terrorist groups like the Klan. But the reality is, in any major metropolitan area in America, United States, from 1945 to the 1970s, really to the present, you take any major police force, they killed more people, more Black folk than the Klan in the entire South. Any year, choose a year. Like the NYPD have killed more people every year since they have existed since the Klan. So you can get rid of the Klan and you're still going to deal with racial terror in America. Obstacles and oppositions remain the same. This last word, and I'm through. That's the Baptist church in me. This last word, and I'm through. Amen. Lastly, if we're going to try to put this movement and the activism of our young people into proper historical context, then what we cannot do is try to frame and understand what they're doing through a prism of the President of the United States. We cannot look to the presidency of Barack Obama and say all this is a result of his presence, his election. Like, that doesn't work. We learned a long time ago. Civil rights scholars and others have pointed a long time ago. Look, you can't understand Black political behavior through the prism of a presidency. Right? Lyndon Johnson is not going to explain what's happening in Mississippi. Right? Lyndon Johnson doesn't explain why Fannie Lou Hamer is doing what Fannie Lou Hamer is doing. Barack Obama isn't going to explain why young people are taken to the streets today. Right? We have to take, and Emily Crosby understands with a wonderful book on this, a bottom-up perspective rather than a top-down perspective. Barack Obama is going to be critically important to understanding this moment, but he's not the central figure for understanding why young black people are doing the things that they're doing. If anything, they're doing what they're doing in spite of his presence and not because of his presence. Thank you very much.
First, I want to thank Debbie and Pam for having me and organizing this conference and allowing me. I'm still full of thoughts from all the other wonderful speakers, not just Jeanne and Hasan, but all the other ones before. And I'm really sad that I have to go last because I'm kind of weighed down and thinking about all the other things that have been said today. But I want to dive right in with Julian. I loved Julian enough to go with him and Pam to a 4 Freshmen concert. That's a long way from go-go, I think, or hip-hop or anything else. It was an amazing, tormenting mystery why he loved the 4 Freshmen so much. It was one of many eccentricities early in our relationship, right down to near the very end when I did get to take him and Pam into the men's room of a restaurant in Jackson, Mississippi, where it was dedicated to Elvis Presley, and the urinals were painted like motorcycles. And there were quotes all over the inside of the restroom, and Julian was in heaven. He loved all these quotes. Richard Nixon, Einstein quoted about Elvis Presley. We did a lot of amazing things. Our relationship began in 1968 in Atlanta when we wanted to challenge Lester Maddox at the Democratic Convention, modeled on what the Mississippi Freedom Democrats had done in 1964. And we went up there. I was basically Julian's gopher because he was quite young, and I was still in college, or just out of college. And we went up there, and we didn't think we were going to get seated. We had all these hearings, and we were positioning ourselves for 1972. And then all of a sudden they said, "You're seated." And we had 75 people that we had elected back in Atlanta, mostly poor and rural, no way of getting them to Chicago in 2 days. And every hotel, no money to fly them there. And every hotel had been rented for 6 months. So in desperation, a few days later, Julian told me, find the money for some airplane tickets and get us some hotel rooms. And a couple of days later, in desperation, we went to the home of Elijah Muhammad in Chicago. I was not allowed to go in for pigmentation reasons. But Julian went in and came out and said that we had a promise of both hotel rooms and airline tickets, which was really amazing to me. I couldn't believe this. And the next day, this fellow named Walter Turner showed up. He was Mr. Elijah Muhammad's fixer. Very, very large, bulking man who took me into the Del Prado Hotel where I had been begging for hotel rooms. And they had laughed at me. And Walter said, "May I please speak to the manager?" And he went back, and the manager came out about 5 minutes later and said, "Yes, we have 65 rooms for you." I don't know how this happened. That night we went with Walt. Julian and I went with Walter to a nightclub on the south side of Chicago, and we walked into this jamming place. It was after midnight. It was really late. I was nervous as I could be, because it looked like the place was full of gangsters and women who would eat you for lunch. And Walter had this gigantic wad of money, and he walked through, and everybody knew him, and they all kind of parted. And I was looking very nervous and looking at Julian, and he turned to me and he said, "I do this all the time." which was his way of saying that just because he was black, he was no more comfortable in there than I was. We had adventures beginning then and for the rest of his life with Pam and all through that convention. That's the tear gas convention. That's the world is watching convention. That's the police riot convention. I got to spend one entire anxiety-ridden hour with Fannie Lou Hamer at that convention, because there was a brief moment when she was going to nominate Ted Kennedy for president, and my job was to make sure nobody kidnapped her or took her away. And I stood there asking her what she was going to say, because she didn't have a speech written or anything. And she said, "The Lord will tell me what to say." And anyway, I was enthralled. But when you hang out with Julian, really fun things happen, and profound things too. We talked a lot about history and the application of history. Julian believed that history is about the future. History lights the future if you will let it. And that's why I think civil rights history is not about what it was. It's about resisting how strong the impulse is in the culture to say that the civil rights movement is about quaint old practices from the past that applied only to black people. I am now, by way of illustration on this, I've just had a crisis this week at my 7th studio trying to make films based on my work about the civil rights era, and about my 25th screenwriter, going all the way back to Alex Haley. I mean, Alex Haley has been dead a long time, so we go way back. The lesson that I have about the difficulties of putting the movement on the screen is that the movement was about people who were every day in internal conflict about what to do, and at each other's throats all night in these all-night meetings you were talking about, over first principles, over agenda, over sacrifice, over risk, over tactics, over everything else. And people in Hollywood are terrified to show that as a reality, because all they want is for people to think that they know what the morally correct, safe position is. And you can't show conflict if you're worried that somebody's going to think you don't have the right position. And that's why we have a hard time portraying the movement now. I want to pay tribute. We have 6 or 7 SNCC people here. One of your colleagues in 1964 said publicly that the freedom movement is spreading the widest liberation in human history. It was seen as a, people didn't pay that much attention to it, but the quotation was defended. I would submit to you that, as breathtaking as it is, that history has proven that to be an understatement of what the movement set loose. That's 1964. At that time, this crowd on this campus at the University of Virginia would have had everybody's palms sweating, I tell you that. The university then at Virginia had no female students by state law. The movement let loose freedom far beyond the African-American professors that we have here that are tenured in wonderful schools, and the changes that we appreciate in the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, and the changes there. Polish dock workers who couldn't speak English memorized the words to "We Shall Overcome." And the Soviet Union dissolved 20 years later without a shot being fired, and they were at the Berlin Wall, they were singing "We Shall Overcome" there and in Prague. What happened in South Africa, what has happened for women, if you have a daughter today, if you're a Southern cracker, the word is used now, if you're a Southern cracker today and you have a daughter that you want to play intercollegiate sports or go to any of the Ivy League universities, let alone a military academy. It's the freedom that was let loose by this movement. Even the most visionary person in 1964 could never have imagined the equal marriage equality movement, because gay behavior was, the word gay wasn't invented. Homosexual behavior was criminal. The idea that we would march through decriminalization, cringing tolerance, and civil union on the notion of what equal citizenship meant was far-fetched by anybody's standards, and it was set in motion by the freedom movement. When you deal with race, it opens gates for everybody. My question is this. I think that in a sane and just world at home with its history, everybody, it would be common knowledge to thank the SNCC veterans here for setting loose freedom that broadly. When you deal with the race issue, it opens all the gates to freedom. In that sense, the freedom movement leaders who spread the widest liberation in human history served the same function as the American revolutionaries who confronted systems of monarchy and hierarchy and set in motion a very imperfect but a vision of freedom, of we the people. So that these are modern founders in my view, but they are not treated as such. Why? That's the question. Why have we allowed an era in which these people spread the widest liberation in human history to be dominated by cynicism and gridlock about the capacities of people's movements and national politics? There's a huge gap between freedom that nobody believed was possible and the unappreciation for it that allows us to have this cynicism. Now, did we let this happen? Why did it happen? My first answer is that American culture is so deep that it does not want to honor an African-American founders, modern founders citizenship movement. It doesn't want to do it. Our culture is permeated. People want to minimize the influence of the freedom movement and make it quaint and make it something in the past and pat black folks on the head for what was done about quaint problems over where to sit on the bus a long time ago. But when I talked to Julian, you know, Julian's last, marriage equality was one of his last crusades at the NAACP board. To hear him tell the real stories of getting the endorsement for marriage equality through the NAACP board, which he thought was never possible, was an amazing application of him saying that this movement is about going forward. But he could not make marriage equality the end of the movement. And we're kind of stuck trying to figure out why American politics is not more functional, why we don't have a better balance between this freedom and the future ahead of us. I think that we need to analyze those questions. We've got these new movements starting now and honor them and say the only thing that the old movement has is that they were wrestling with fundamental questions. They were arguing about the politics, we the people, and how they were grounding a message that could grow. Are we anti-government or are we pro-constitution? Where are we going to set our fundamental principles? Do we advocate violence or do we lift up nonviolence, or are we somewhere in between? Those questions can't really be dodged. I think violence and nonviolence are the most neglected topics on college campuses today. They're the most salient issues for young people. Our culture is saturated with it. We condemn violence everywhere. For the record, we condemn it between husband and wife, parent and child, out in the streets, in the international world, and yet in every crisis we turn around and use it. Our movement is divided over the functionality of violence and nonviolence. That is a question that we really need to wrestle with if you're going to elevate the strategy and the ferment. We're percolating now with Black Lives Movement toward coalescing into a movement. And when you do that, I think you're going to have to deal with the question of violence and nonviolence and the question of our Constitution and our government. Why isn't the right to vote, I mean, education, a constitutional right? What constitutional issues relative to corporations and economic justice should be raised to the level of the Constitution? I think these kids can deal with those issues. I think they already are. But I hope that we will do that going forward. When you speak of nonviolence as it applied to the movement, I generally support nonviolence as an engine of a lot of the changes that got going in the movement. You know, that's why I think we were blinded to what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. The national security experts couldn't see that it was gonna, that the nuclear doomsday arsenal was gonna dissolve. It has power. But where I want you to think about it a little bit, and this is where I'll end. We're in a historic election now in which the racial subtext that has always been in American politics is bubbling up to the surface, right? Bubbling up to the surface enough that people are saying, we may not respect the vote. We may not respect the vote. We've never heard that before. What is a vote? A vote is a piece of nonviolence. A vote is our commitment to settle things, we the people, as opposed to shooting. We have to understand that very, very fundamental things like that are at stake, that our politics are saturated with race, even now, and we don't really recognize it. George Wallace, Martin Luther King, who, by the way, was the one who said the freedom movement is setting loose the widest liberation in human history, said that in December 1963, at the end of the same year when Wallace was inaugurated saying freedom, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, George Wallace changed his stump speech and said, I have never made a statement in my public life that denigrated anyone because of his race. My only purpose is to rescue American politics from biased liberal media and big government by pointy-headed bureaucrats and tyrannical judges. He invented the whole vocabulary of modern government right there. And why did it work? It worked because white people wanted to believe it. They wanted to believe that it was innocent. And only now are we getting wonderful historians beginning to strip a more honest accounting of American history, and it will take that for a Black Lives Matter movement to restore kind of the spirit of the civil rights movement that Julian so brilliantly embodied for his whole career. Thank you.
Thanks to our wonderful panelists. That was an eye-opening discussion of the connections between civil rights and Black Lives Matter. Before we get into Q&A, I want to give just a quick minute to Ms. Judy Richardson.
Really quick, Wes, we're on. 1 second. You know, we mentioned the SNCC Legacy Project and our collaboration with Duke University. This is Wesley Hogan, who is the director of the Documentary Center for Documentary Media. I got permission to do this. I'm doing this very quick. Is that okay? Okay. So we're just passing this out. These are cards for the One Vote SNCC site. And just to know, oops, okay, one over here.
Just to say how amazing your work is for this.
Oh, okay, well, yes, I'm on the board, our SNCC, Charlie Cobb and I, because we're talking about SNCC from the inside out. So it's not just academics who are talking about us, it's we in collaboration with the academics like Wes, like Emily Crosby, who's on our editorial board, like Hasan Jeffries, who's on our editorial board. It is a wonderful site. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, and I'm going to open up the floor for questions. Yes, ma'am. Right here.
So I just want to complicate this a little bit. So my fellow academics, right? So I'm also a college instructor, but I'm also in the street. So my name is Jill Humphreys. I'm just going to self-disclose because I'm in the street with the millennials who I've taught over the classrooms, but I'm in the streets as a legal observer. So I'm out there for the National Lawyers Guild observing any kind of interaction between law enforcement, National Guard, and protecting the First Amendment rights of demonstrators. But this is an internal conversation that we don't want to disclose. But I wanted, since you all brought it up and paint a different image, I think we need to have the conversation. And that is the discussion about what's really happening internally with Black Lives Matter, which is, or movement Black Lives, which is made of different groups, has different dynamics, and different ways in which the value system gets expressed as to who is considered part of the movement. So legal observers, in my mind, are part of the movement of groups and people out there in the street, not just the quote-unquote activists that you see in the news. But as I've traveled around the country, I was in Baltimore, I set up a rapid response legal hub, South Carolina, Kenny, Texas, where I encountered a semiotic counter-protesters bringing semi-automatic AR-15s to protest. Right? So my issue is this, and my question is this. I think there's a fundamental difference between the SNCC members that I've been talking to, not just here, but across my lifespan, and folk that I came of age with in Southern Africa, where I worked as someone at age 20, and talked to people who were part of NK, right, in Kwame, and my fellow Movement for Black Lives activists, right? So the question is this. Folks, I've encountered incursions within the movement as I've moved around the country. That is people who, there's this lack of openness and willingness that we have different perspectives and views and ideological beliefs about tactics and philosophies. And so there have been purges in certain local BLM groups, right? There have been, I've directly experienced when some activists, while I'm facing the police, will spit over my shoulder, right? Which shows to me that they're training about respecting and protecting all of us who are part of the movement, which is something I learned in Southern Africa. Folk on the ground, some folk on the ground understood that we protect all people who are part of the movement, but that value system varies across this movement, right? We don't want to talk about this. My fellow social historians who I am in college with know this, but don't want to disclose it because of kind of like what you said. And that is, we don't want to disparage, right, or present in front of the world like an alternative image about what's perhaps is also going on, in addition to countering the state-sanctioned violence. And so, my question is, to what extent is the Afro-pessimist philosophy, right? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. So, Sadea Hartman and Frank Wilderson, who is also in South Africa, to what extent is Afro-pessimism, at least what I've experienced from my fellow millennials, as their grounding, which is very different than the SNCC philosophical foundations when I spoke to Emory talking about hope. Afro-pessimism is counter to hope, right? So can you all complicate this conversation about, what the way in which you all painted this picture, I want to say somewhat rosy picture of my fellow millennials who I love, I'm in the streets with them, supporting them, but we need to be honest about, I think there are some differences and problems that we need to address.
I'll take a quick stab at that. One, the characterization that you offer does not come as a surprise to me at all. There is no moment in the history of the African American freedom struggle in which you don't have what you just described. It appears in almost every organization at different times and in different ways. 1950s, NAACP, going through communist purges, different local branches. Have you ever read what Du Bois said about Marcus Garvey? Right? It ain't flattering, right? I mean, so in other words, this is something that every movement moment has to come to grips with. And I think it's incumbent upon us
in this room who straddle the line between academic scholar and scholar activists, those who may be in the streets, and those who may just be in the classroom but are engaged with those who are in the streets, to not paint too rosy a picture. When I began doing research on Lowndes County, Alabama, and the movement there, when I start as an example of what we must do as scholars, all I knew was what happened up until 1970. They created this independent political party. They elect their first African-American sheriff, John Hewlett, and this person, John Hewlett, was so central to the movement. The movement doesn't happen without him. In 1970, he becomes sheriff. Fantastic. Had no idea what happened after. I go down and start doing research and doing interviews. Some 30 years later, he's still there as probate judge, and essentially has become a black liberal boss. And so it's fully moved away from the kind of freedom politics, movement politics that he had been so committed for, that he put his life on the line for. Now, as a scholar, I had a choice. Like, I was disappointed. I wanted to end the story right there in 1970. Movement struggle, black sheriff, we win, see ya, right? That's it. I don't want to have to write about what happens after, right? I don't want to have to write about him going and making these backroom deals. I don't want to have to write about the kind of politics that undermines the movement culture. But in the end, I decided that it is incumbent upon me as a scholar to do that, because activists, if I see this work, I didn't tell the press this, but I saw this as an organizing manual, right? Like, you go back and you see what they did so that people can extract from that lessons about how to do something similar. If I left out the part of how it unravels and why it unravels, then we wind up with this rosy picture and it doesn't do anybody any good. So I think it's incumbent upon us, both in the classroom when we're talking and telling this, and in the work that we do, to paint a complete picture, which very much involves the kinds of things that you describe, so that so not just that when it happens, people can say, oh, that's not unexpected, but that when they begin, they can be prepared for when it happens, because it's inevitable. And in addition to that, you're also going to have to deal, if you look at any movement, with counterintelligence efforts. I mean, we know, you look at Charlotte, I mean, you know, every one of these movements, street protests, you're going to have undercover plainclothes officers, right? So don't be surprised when they're there. Expect them to be there, right? That's from Malcolm, when he always began his, talks, he would say, welcome, he did his Muslim greeting, welcome brothers, welcome friends, and welcome enemies, because they're there, right? I mean, so I think part of what you're saying is it should not come as a surprise to young people, so we have to be prepared for it. I don't have the answer for how we deal with it, but I think the first step towards dealing with it productively is to say, you know what? We have to expect it to happen in progressive movements. And look, if you want to eliminate it completely, right, just be a dictator, right? Say, if you just make all the decisions yourself, then you don't have that problem. But if you want a democratic movement with democratic goals, then this is one of the things that we're all going to have to deal with.
I'd like to make a very quick comment on that. One is I do think that we have to acknowledge that in a very general sense, the larger culture, not within the African American movement in the 60s, but the larger American culture was more optimistic in 1960 than our culture is today. We had just won World War II, we had licked polio, we were going to the moon. It was a more optimistic culture than today. So that is a burden for this movement. The other point I would make, and we should talk to those SNCC veterans who are here, but there was, to me, in my interviews, from 60 to 62, there was a honeymoon period where sacrifice itself and the culture of sacrifice as bonding in the movement cut down on purges and internal, there were lots of arguments and everything, but if you were willing to sacrifice, there was a bond. That's when they talked about a circle of trust and bonds. It didn't last forever. Political struggles came later, but there was an early period where there was hope, in part from that whole culture, but there was also more cohesion because you were sacrificing together.
Right, Leah?
I said in my opening remarks that Julian would want us to think of him as a race man and as someone easily amused. But I feel like he would also want me to say, he would say, if he were here, that he was an optimist until the day he died. And if you're not, you don't have hope, and if you don't have hope, you'll never have change.
Yeah, I wanted to, just, I guess it's a little Taylor. I think that we're kind of going through a paradigm shift, and that's much different than in the 60s. Because if you look at, say, the last election, I think you mentioned Obama, and if you just talk to people, you would think that most white people in America voted for Obama. And they didn't. You only had like 43% of white people in this country that voted for Obama. And that tells you something about the racial and ethnic change that's going on in this country and how that ethnicity is moving one way and white America is moving another way. And I think that this becomes important because even if white values aren't changing, their numbers are decreasing. And with that decrease, I think you're getting that theater that we talked about earlier, and nobody does it better than Trump. So that you have all that stuff laid out there in the raw, in a way, that it has to be interrogated. If there's a problem in white America, it's definitely on display now. And I think that we're going to have to deal with those things. You know, whites have to deal with themselves, and it's not something that blacks can do. You know, we talk about SNCC, and you know, you just have to be, you know, pleased as punch at them. And I'm probably even more pleased at Black Lives Matter because they're doing this in the absence of black role models. Because one thing integration did was to take a lot of that away from them. So I think it was Alicia Garcia. She's one of the top people within Black Lives Matter. I met her a couple of weeks ago at the Legal Aid fundraiser here in Charleston. And she's very dynamic, very verbal, very much has interrogated that, enough so that she's sitting on a panel with John Grisham. And you know he's done everything with regard to the Innocence Project and a lot of other things. And I think we don't often take into consideration a lot of what is going on with regard to these young people and how hard they are fighting to make a way for themselves within the context of a lot of things that we're not just so that
I thought that was very interesting. I'm not sure, but there's a question. I mean, I think that the saturation of American history with racial politics is a problem for white people, but it's also a problem for all of us. So how do those who recognize that the problem is and always has been, I mean, look at it. You have the Civil War graphically showed America with all these bodies and stacks of bodies that America's original sin was slavery. And the next 50 years, the foundation of American social science was built on the notion of white supremacy. I mean, every major, the American Sociological Association, Psychiatric Association, every single one of them. The National Academy of Sciences was founded by a guy who believed that blacks and Louis Agassiz, that blacks and whites were totally different species, that black people were subhuman. He's the founder of the National Academy of Sciences. We spent 50 years convincing ourselves that white culture was at the epitome of eugenics. You know, all these sciences came out of that. And, you know, 1965 comes along. Pat Moynihan is significant for one thing. The movement had just set in motion American freedom, and he says, wait a minute, we're still the doctors, and you're still the problem. Regardless of fighting over what his evidence was, the assertion was, we are still the experts. That's how he's the only sociology professor specializing in urban ethnology who had a long career in the United States Senate, right? Because he said we're still the doctors. So yes, it is a pervasive problem in American history, but the kids in Black Lives Matter need to be aware of that when they're fighting for their own agenda. And I would hope that the whole country can come together to try to address this, because we're still drifting along on a total pretend version of our history. I mean, this election is saturated from politics, but race was never mentioned in the last debate. That's just the way it is. We still live in a culture where we either talk about politics or we talk about race. There are alternative realities instead of intimate components of each other, and they always have been.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and I'm going to ask it. So, Dr. Jeffries, you mentioned continuities in terms of tactics and strategies and obstacles and opposition between the civil rights movement and the movement for Black Lives. And Dr. Theoharis, you mentioned at the end of your talk that we're in the midst of an intersectional and global movement. And so I wondered if, panelists, if you could comment on this question of whose Black Lives Matter. How do you see current activists struggling with intersections within this fight for all Black lives? And do you see continuities? Do you see change from prior social movements?
Part of why we teach history, and part of, I think, why a lot of us over the course of today have been talking about what we get from this history, is both sort of where we've been, but how we might go in different places. And I do feel like one of the places that I feel like that learning perhaps has been the greatest is around this question of intersectionality and how central that is in many of the movement conversations I've been in to kind of what Black Lives Matter means and how we're going to define what justice looks like, or what our freedom is. And so I think that's both a continuity with the movements of the 50s and 60s and 70s, and also a learning from, and ways that we're not going to compartmentalize in certain kinds of ways. And so, and I think with the global part of it, to me, one of the things that I part of what I see the role of us as teachers is to sort of show the past more truthfully. So again, like Taylor was saying, to sort of write the future, but that not that we are the people to sort of say this is the path, but to be really, I mean, I've been really struck by the backlash against the movement for Black Lives, that like part of their statement around Palestine, and how just the uproar and sort of saying this is completely inappropriate, and the ways that I think it both, to me, it both partakes of questions that people were grappling with 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago in terms of this struggle is not just a domestic struggle, but a global struggle. But we also are going to think about the justice issues of our time, and we're not going to not speak about them. And so I guess, to me, that's a very, right, that there's something that's both continuous and innovative, I guess.
I would just add that pointing to, and for those who haven't taken a look at us, I highly encourage you to. The platform that was mentioned earlier, that we saw some elements of the platform from the movement for Black Lives, and just the groups that are identified in there, that they specifically call out that they are in solidarity with LGBTQ, immigrants, undocumented workers, those who engage in Palestinian decolonizing struggles, folk in Latin America, folk in Africa, folk in Asia. Now, to a certain extent, that's a break from sort of 50s, 60s Cold War era, just in the articulation of it and in advancement. I mean, think about, Bayard Rustin and others had to be sort of kept on the sidelines to a certain extent. And here you're saying we have to be engaged in solidarity with them. So in that sense, there is a difference. But I wouldn't want to diminish at all some of the continuity
because there has always been a Pan-Africanness thrust in the African American freedom struggle. There has always been a sense of solidarity with folk who were fighting against colonial empire. And I think in a very real way, we're hearing the echoes of earlier work, and that's not by accident. I think folk who have been engaged in Black Lives Matter have been learning this, have been hearing it, and we're seeing that reflected, but they also have taken it to a different level publicly, and we see that articulated in their demands in a way that shows a kind of maturity that I think ought to be commended and celebrated and defended by those of us who want to see the kind of change that they're asking and demanding.
I would only say a little bit off that point that as much as we're looking for political and cultural solidarity to deal with the basic justice issues that we have, we're also in an increasingly interdependent world. There's no getting around it. And in the last 30 years, we've lifted the world has lifted nearly 1 billion people out of poverty. Our clothes, all of us are wearing clothes that are a lot cheaper because we've lifted the world out of poverty, but the cost is a higher level of displacement and anxiety in the United States that is exacerbating insecurity and racial antagonism. So we're part of a larger story. One lesson that comes out of that to me is that somebody needs to start thinking about corporate governance. Not just I'm against corporations, but how are corporations governed? They all get charters that are supposed to charter them in the public interest. You know, the corporations don't give the government a charter gives the corporations, and yet nobody's paying attention to that. And to some degree, they've become sovereign, and they don't care about these problems and aren't helping. But I think the larger interdependence is a big issue that any movement is going to need to be aware of.
Thank you all so much for your responses. Let's give our panel a hand. All right, and Dr. McDowell has just a couple of quick announcements.